Mayor.
How are you? You guys stayed. All right.
They're staying for John Baptiste.
Yeah.
No, they're staying for you. This is a tall order to follow, Grant Hill and Adam Silver, but you guys are up for it. I'm firmly convinced. So Amazon's search for a second headquarters has brought into sharp relief the discussion of the haves and the have-nots of technology. And even cities that are winning, like Seattle, there is increasing amount of pushback to the power of tech. I'm really happy to have three of the leading voices in this debate on the stage. And Steve, I'd like to start with you. Could you describe what you've been doing? You have been traveling the country, I think, to over 100 communities with something called Rise of the Rest.
Well, really, first of all, it's great to be here, and it's great to have the New York Times focus on this issue of cities and how do you think about cities in the future and inclusive economies and so forth. What we've been trying to do is shine a spotlight on the cities and on the entrepreneurs in those cities that are really showing a lot of momentum, but their stories aren't often told. And it's much harder to raise the venture capital to start and scale those companies. Not every company that's successful raises venture capital, but the most successful companies do. And right now there's a real disconnect where 75% of the venture capital in this country goes to 3 states, California, New York, Massachusetts, and the other 47 states are fighting over the other 25%. And given the startups create most of the jobs, not small business, not big business, but young, high-growth startups, if we're not backing the startups everywhere, we're going to see a growing divide, I think, where innovation happening, disruption happening on the coast like Silicon Valley disrupts jobs in the middle of the country, and we're not offsetting that, at least in part, by creating jobs in those communities. So that's the Rise Rest is all about trying to identify some of these promising entrepreneurs, some of these emerging companies, invest in them and champion them with the hope it won't just lead to successful companies, but in the process can also help strengthen many of these communities.
And how much have you invested?
We created a fund about a year ago with 40 pretty prominent individual investors, Eric Schmidt and Howard Schultz and Meg Whitman and Tory Burch and Jeff Bezos and people like that. It was a $150 million fund. We've made 100 investments in 50 cities in 35 states, and we really are quite pleased by the momentum we're seeing.
Walter, you've written about Steve Jobs in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. Is there something inherent about Silicon Valley that makes what Steve is trying to do and what even you're now trying to do in New Orleans just so difficult? Everybody's always wanted to be the other Silicon Valley.
Well, throughout history, there have been certain cities that are cradles of creativity. You can go to the 1470s and look at Florence because they had a banking industry and the Renaissance exploding. You can go 300 years later to the 1770s, what happened in Philadelphia, the 1970s, what happened in Silicon Valley with the confluence of everything from the free speech movement to the defense industry and microchips. And these things create the sort of fertile ground for innovation. So the question is, how do you take that formula and spread it out? It happened in the 1470s when it spread out from Florence. It's happening now in the 1970s as it spread out. We have the mayor of Seattle. Seattle is one of the other great hubs of innovation, but what it takes is a set of ingredients, including a comfort with new ideas and diversity. Steve's wife, Jean, has a book coming out called Fearless. It takes a willingness to take risks and even to fail at times. It takes a great university, whether it be Florence or Philadelphia in the 1770s when Ben Franklin starts the academy that becomes the University of Pennsylvania, or Stanford when it's Silicon Valley. So here in New Orleans, Tulane and other universities are an engine of this. But I think we all have to learn from what cities can replicate it. And the more difficult question is you watch Columbus come up, where Steve's partner, J.D. Vance, has been very involved. 50 miles away, you have Dayton, and it's not coming up. So you want to say, let's do the list. Great university in Columbus, not as much in Dayton. So I won't try to diss Dayton, but doesn't have the same ingredients, and we have to say why.
Mm-hmm. Mayor Durkan, what did Seattle do right in terms of, it is plausibly the other Silicon Valley of the West at this point?
Yeah, I would say that's right, and I'd say a couple things. First is we're the better Silicon Valley. And we have this, small mom and pop companies that kind of stay below the radar until they're not, like Starbucks and Costco and Microsoft and Nordstrom and Amazon.
And Boeing,
yeah. And so we've had this real, I think the thing you'll see in the cities that succeed is, one, there's got to be a willingness to reinvent the future. And that's what city of Seattle's been like, is we always are that city that invents the future from the 62 World's Fair on. How do we get better? How do we do the next thing, the next great thing? You also have to then have that coalescence of talent, that people are there that can stock those companies. And so when Microsoft, grows up in Seattle, Amazon locates there because they know they can benefit. Google, Facebook. But I think one thing that's really interesting, what Steve has noted, and what Walter has too, is even in the successful cities, the success masks this other part of the city that hasn't risen. And we've seen that in Seattle with a huge growth of tech and the new economy, but it masks some real displacement, some real lack of opportunity. And I think with cities, even the cities that are successful, bridging that gap is the real trick that we're going to have to do.
Wade, that's a really important point we should put a pin in, is that you can grow an economy and have success. The real question is, can you have equitable growth? And sometimes certain industries, including in this city, the hospitality industry, growing rapidly, but it doesn't help shrink the economic divide. And we have to look, especially as we go into an age of technology disrupting jobs, how are we going to make sure everybody participates in such growth?
The two things to add. One is the data on job creation. I should talk about, when we talk about startups, not just tech startups. There are obviously startups all across the economy that are equally important, often create even more jobs. But for every startup job, there's usually 5 to 6 other jobs in the community that are created, because if a city's rising, like as Seattle has, there's more people want houses, so there's construction jobs, and people eat at restaurants. So there's a whole other class of jobs that count. Conversely, when you're losing population, this is what the mayor talked about in terms of the decline of Detroit and now trying to kind of rebuild Detroit, that has a disproportionate effect as well. The other point to note is that it's been long said that creativity and intelligence is broadly distributed, but opportunity is not. And what's happened for the past half century is many people in many parts of the country left. There's a huge brain drain because they didn't feel the opportunity was there. It was elsewhere, Silicon Valley or some other, Seattle, some other place. So part of this is about creating enough opportunity there and enough possibility there so it slows the brain drain of people leaving and actually triggers a little bit of a boomerang of people returning because suddenly the opportunity is there. I think that's critical. And I just point out with Seattle, the success of Microsoft and Amazon in Seattle was somewhat accidental. Bill Gates started in Seattle because he was from Seattle. They actually started a company in Albuquerque and then moved to Seattle because he and Paul Allen wanted to kind of go home. Jeff Bezos started in Seattle because Microsoft was there. And he figured there's some tech talent there he could pick off. So Seattle's boom over the last several decades has been those kind of factors. That's true all across the country. The success of Austin is many things, but Michael Dell being there was critical. So how do you make sure the Michael Dells can stay there and start and scale there as opposed to feeling like they have to flee and go to one of the coasts?
I want to talk about the obligation of tech to society. And Mayor Durkan, you've been through an interesting few months in Seattle where the city council passed a tax on big business to help take care of the housing crisis there. And Amazon and Starbucks and other companies pushed back, and that was rescinded. I know it's a long debate, but could you talk both about that and just, these companies are, Anand said earlier, making more money than we've ever known, probably more influential than Standard Oil ever was. What is their basic obligation to those who are being left behind?
I think we've got to really take a deep look, and I won't limit it to just Seattle, but I think with the rise of the technology economy, that with it is coming great obligation that right now isn't being met. And everyone talks about the gig economy, but really the gig economy just means people without benefits, making not very good wages, and no stability. And if you look at some of the gig economy, it's like the old piecework with the seamstresses. They would just come and be paid by the piece. And so I think we have a real obligation to look at what is our economy going forward. And as we know, displacement is coming through innovation, whether it's automation and the lack of drivers. It's one of the single most important jobs in America is the driver. Truck drivers, taxi drivers, delivery. 40 million plus people who will be out of work probably in 10 years. And no plan on what we do to pick up that thing. So I think that the tech companies and government working together have a real obligation to be planning for that future and saying now, what are the fundamental things that government can do? and what are the things that the companies themselves and their philanthropy have to do.
What is the status of the housing situation in Seattle?
Seattle, it is really, really tough. We are bound by water on both sides, and we are the fastest growing city in America. We added so much population, our housing stock wasn't ready. So the median house is about $725,000, and there's just no affordable housing. So we also have a large homelessness problem. And part of that is it's very hard to have exits out of homelessness, even though we're spending more than we've ever spent before, because there's no affordable housing. So we're trying to build as much affordable housing, and we're losing that middle income housing as well. And so we're becoming a disparate city of very expensive housing and very poor housing. So our job as a city is, how do we meet that challenge? How do we build that city, not just for today, but for 5, 10, and 20 years, that has pulled together both the education system, the job system, what government supports, and really bringing business to the table.
And are you satisfied that the tech companies are going to come to the table?
I think
even
they are.
without
We're
that tax?
seeing more of them come, but I think it's going to be, you saw there was a big fight in San Francisco.
Yeah.
You know, between the tech companies themselves, between don't tax us, we'll do it only anyways. But governments who are there left having to fund those social services have to have stable revenues.
Walter, how does the backlash against tech affect all this?
I think there's been a sense that technology was going to save us, it was going to connect us. When America went online, when Steve and I were young with AOL, it was going to make us all one community. And when AOL was created, it was sort of a moderated civil community. Now, when you get to what's happening with Facebook undermining our democracy and democracies around the world, unintentionally, but it's a platform they built, and when you have everything from 4chan to the types of things that are adding to the incivility, the luster of don't do evil from Google and we're going to connect the world from Facebook, that luster has disappeared quite a bit.
The other piece of this that I don't think gets that much attention is the nature of innovation and disruption is changing, and the rule book that we've used for the last 25 years is largely intact, and particularly called the third wave of the internet. When the first wave was getting everybody online, the second wave has been apps and software running on top of the internet, Facebook, et cetera. The third wave is really integrating in healthcare, food and agriculture, some big parts of our lives, big sectors of the economy. But what's different than that software-centric, app-centric second wave is partnerships are going to be critical. You can't go it alone. And policy is going to be critical. These are regulated businesses, and there's a reason why they're regulated. You can debate what the regulation should be, but there'll be some regulations around drug safety, some regulations around drones in the sky and driverless cars on the road. Yet we've been, some of the innovators, the entrepreneurs have been slow to embrace that because they get frustrated by dealing with government. Yeah. It slows them down. It's bureaucratic, et cetera. And there's obviously some truth to that. But understanding the nature of innovation is changing is going to be critical. And I think it ties in a way that I think will advantage these rise of the rest cities, because a lot of the domain expertise in healthcare or in agriculture are in places in the middle of the country. So if we can surround them with the mentoring and the partnerships and the capital to take those ideas and scale, it will give them some opportunities. And I also think this backlash, not just against big tech, but also specifically against Silicon Valley, will end up playing to the benefit of these rising cities.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think we're living in a more displacing time than the Industrial Revolution. I think that this change in our economy is turning everything upside down, and it's hard to know where it will cycle through. But I do think that, I love our tech companies and their workers. They're unbelievably innovative. They are forward-looking. They're disruptive. But we're always retrofitting for the consequences. I mean, you just look at cyber. No one wanted to think about the security and the hacking. It's like, let's just build it, then we'll fix it later. Well, we're seeing the real consequences of what that has done with millions of people's personal information being stolen daily. So I think that right now we're at a moment in time where we can actually have some good discussions, and the cities are the one who can have it and can make it real, is what does it look like and what is that obligation going forward? Because we can't stop innovation, but we can plan for it.
I was going to build a little bit on what Steve said, which is the third wave of the digital revolution, not being about engineering, connecting engineering, but about connecting it to other industries. And when Steve goes into Chattanooga, you have a trucking industry, and you suddenly see it's being transformed by technology. Well, Chattanooga is the best place to be creative about that. I see Gene Nathan here. We were talking about the creative industries of New Orleans. You're going to see a John Batiste. When you connect a creativity and the creative economy that this city is particularly good at with technology, that helps build on that. So I think this current wave, the third wave, as Steve called it in his book, is happening because we're going to different places and connecting the comparative strengths of those cities, whether it be creativity or trucking, to the internet.
And I think, I think it's going to have a real political benefit for the country if we can do what Steve's talking about, because, you look at the demographics right now, and everyone thinks that, within 20 years, close to 80% of the population will be living in cities. But those cities won't have 80% of the senators or the electoral votes. Right. And so if we don't have a very intentional way of having an economy that's shared, we will continue to have political divides, which I think in the long term is bad for us. So I think that there's not only the reasons to do it because it's right, but for the democracy, I think it's the right thing.
The other piece on that, and the political implication of this, there's a Pew Study that came out a few months ago that was pretty sobering. It said that 75% of Americans are anxious about the future, worried about the future. Much of it, the things we're talking about, technology and disruption. When they hear disruption in Silicon Valley, they think that's somehow going to be bad for their family, bad for their community. And again, if you look at the data where the venture capital goes and the job creation engine, it's not like they're feeling like they're being left behind. They kind of are being left behind. Right. So, but there's not a new issue. We're talking about agriculture. 200 years ago, 90% of us worked on farms. Now it's less than 2% because technology made it easier to grow more food with fewer people, which is a good thing. But we were able to then retrain those people and move them from farms to factories, the whole industrial revolution. We need to make a similar transition in this next wave.
Before we go to questions, I just have to ask you, Amazon has somewhat been the elephant in the room today. We did ask them to appear. But Steve, I mean, this all sounds very good, your efforts to spread the wealth nationally, but Amazon just picked 2 big cities to base its headquarters.
It's a mixed view for me. First of all, the Northern Virginia one is not too far from where we started AOL, so it's great to see that 30 years ago when we started, there was no venture capital there, and it wasn't much of a startup scene, so it's great to see momentum there. But I think it goes back to this point about talent. They basically, when they set out to find 50,000 people in a single city, that really resulted in the cities that were 1 million plus being in the running and the others weren't. Now, 238 applied, and a lot of them knew they didn't have much of a shot, but why not give it a go? My hope is that the 236 that lost, if they take half of the energy they put into rallying their community, driving collaboration, and half of the dollars they were putting on the table to lure them, and refocus that on their startup community, they might create the next Amazon. So my hope is that the Amazon effort, I know there's a lot of controversy about it, can actually end up being a catalyst that has long-term legs and sort of the unintended consequence of rallying these communities to focus on the future, lean in the future, and they can only do it if they collaborate, and they only can do it if they understand that the startups are sort of the seed corn, that some of which will become the big companies like Amazon of tomorrow.
Mayor Durkan, were you relieved when Amazon decided to
it's
second and third headquarters instead of more?
It's really interesting because right about the same time we were thinking about opening a second Seattle. And we decided there's only one Seattle, and I would point out today there is only one Amazon headquarters. It's in Seattle, and I welcome as many branch offices as they can build across America.
Questions? Right there.
Hi there, my name is Nate McCarthy. I come from Quest University, Canada, in Squamish, BC. And I'm originally from Seattle, so my question is for you, Mayor.
Now you're halfway to Whistler. Why are you here?
I know. So there's a great body of scholarship that suggests that the seduction of corporations and, to use some of the rhetoric that was up here today, the tale of urban renaissance and economic prosperity pacify and facilitate a transfer of power as corporations like Amazon integrate and co-develop with the cities. And this gives them political authority through a false sense of necessity within the community or the economy. Perhaps we may see this in the April 2018 tax and this kind of a little bit of coercion that was used in a threat of leaving the city, stopping construction of one of their towers, and as well $25,000 thrown behind as well from other corporations. But my question to you is, how do we navigate the interests of private corporations who use coercion as a mechanism of influence against public voice and interests?
Look, I think the biggest countervailing weight to any movement by public corporations is the power of community. And so if you make sure that you are investing in and balancing in power of community, that's going to be the best counterweight. And that's really what we focus on in Seattle is, first, in those areas that have been underinvested and are being left behind, how do we create economic empowerment there? And how do we do what Steve's talking about, really nurture small businesses, startups, all those entities. In Seattle, most people don't know it, but 4 times as many people work for small businesses than work for Amazon. And so we've really focused on how do we nurture and keep those small businesses and startups. We're looking at, for example, having a B&O tax break for the first 3 years of a business's life. So we can nurture those companies that may become the next Amazon, the next Boeing, the next Microsoft, or that may be an artistic venture. So I think we just have to keep in mind that the power they harness is only as great as you let it be. And that there is an economic power that every city faces because you want your people employed. And the best way against that is to be diversifying your economy and focusing on those parts of the economy that are underserved.
Just to follow up on that, and I know we're almost out of time, Walter and Steve, you kind of walked up to it. Will there be, with this tech backlash, more regulation, more pressure on the tech companies to do?
Yes, there will be. And some of it could have been avoided if they were more proactive in dealing with this, but some of it goes back to this third wave dynamic and the nature of innovation changing, where it's not just about the software, it's about how it impacts our lives in pretty fundamental ways and has a ripple effect throughout our economy and throughout our society. And so there will clearly be more regulations in this third wave than there were in the second. The people that are smart enough to realize that and engage and try to have constructive kind of policies put in place will be the ones who end up benefiting.
Do you think we're going to be seeing more Mark Benioff, Jack Dorsey kind of tech turning on itself before we're done with this?
Probably a little bit. I know both of them, and they both had their arguments. And obviously, from a media standpoint, it was a fun little food fight to cover. I think having more people realizing that any company, not just tech companies, but now tech companies are a major force in our economy and our society. They shoulder a responsibility to do something more than just run their businesses. And one of the areas that I think is interesting to watch, this whole area of impact investing in companies that have more of a purpose and impact motive, not just a short-term profit motive. I think that's going to be a big phenomenon over the next 20 years.
Walter, would Steve Jobs have advocated for more regulation of tech at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we need certain regulations, especially when it comes to the social network and connectivity industries that have become publishing platforms but are regulated as if they were common carrier phone companies. But I think there's a more important thing that could happen, which is more antitrust enforcement. I think what you're seeing, even with Amazon, certainly a lot of companies, is when you have a startup, they can be crushed pretty easily if they come up with a good idea, whether it's diapers or heaven knows what, and the big companies are allowed to leverage the dominance they have in one field to take dominance in another. Ever since we stopped the railways and Standard Oil from doing that 120 years ago, that is the thing that most nurtures a startup economy, most nurtures the fact that somebody here in New Orleans could create ready responders or Lucid or a sampling system, knowing that if they get big, it'll be great for their community, as opposed to we will get crushed by one of the 6 major tech corporations.
I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists. Great job.